On Sunday, December 28, 2014, at 6:18 in the morning, Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501 disappeared from radar over the Karimata Strait. 162 people were on board. One moment it was a routine 2-hour flight from Surabaya to Singapore. The next, nothing. No distress call. No warning. The weather that morning was rough, thunderstorms along the route, but this was a modern Airbus A320, flown by experienced pilots. Why did this aircraft suddenly drop from the sky without a word to air traffic control? The investigation that followed would uncover something that defied decades of aviation logic. I'm Captain James Harlow. I've spent 28 years in the cockpit flying everything from regional jets to wide-body aircraft. Some accidents stand out, not just for their tragedy, but for what they teach us. This is one of them. The Airbus A320-216, registered PK-AXC, was built in 2008. It had been flying for Indonesia AirAsia for 6 years and had logged 23,039 hours in the air across 13,610 flights. The aircraft was well-maintained, modern, and reliable. Its engines, CFM-ICFM 56-5B6 units, were standard for the A320 fleet. There was nothing obviously wrong with this plane. The captain had 47,000 hours in the cockpit, with more than 6,000 on the A320. He had a calm demeanor and was thorough. The first officer, younger but experienced, had 2,275 hours on the A320 and was detail-oriented. Together, they made a crew that, on paper, was fully capable of handling difficult conditions. These weren't reckless pilots. They were professionals. Among the 162 people on that flight were families heading to Singapore for the holidays. Park Eun-ji was a young mother traveling with her infant to meet her husband. Choi Chi-man was a student heading home, thinking about his exams. Oscar Desano, a flight attendant, was known for making passengers feel welcome. These were ordinary people with ordinary lives and plans, just like you and me, on what should have been a very normal flight. They had no idea what was coming. The route from Surabaya to Singapore was a busy corridor that Indonesia AirAsia flew countless times. It was a journey of just over 2 hours. What happened that morning, in the midst of challenging weather, still puzzles people. The pilots knew the storms were there. But what nobody talks about is how a seemingly minor issue can trigger a chain reaction when the stakes are this high. That's where it all went wrong. Flight 8501 departed from Surabaya, heading northeast toward Singapore. The climb was normal, but as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the captain and first officer faced severe thunderstorms ahead, towering cumulonimbus clouds reaching well above their altitude. The captain requested a deviation to the left. Air traffic control approved it. Next, the pilots requested to climb from 32,000 feet to 38,000 feet to get above the worst weather. This is standard procedure. But air traffic control couldn't grant it immediately due to other traffic. They told Flight 8501 to stand by. The crew was stuck. Fly through the storm at a lower altitude or wait, hoping for clearance that might not come soon. They continued at 32,000 feet with the storm clouds ahead. At 6:12 in the morning, a master caution alarm sounded. This kind of alarm isn't necessarily an emergency, it just means something isn't right. In this case, it indicated a fault with the flight warning computer number 1. The flight warning computer is the aircraft's central alert system, its brain for warning pilots about problems. The crew pulled and pushed a circuit breaker to reset it, essentially rebooting the system, like restarting a computer. The warning cleared, but the problem wasn't gone. The warning returned 3 more times in the next few minutes. Each time, the crew reset the circuit breaker, and each time, the warning disappeared. These recurring faults were annoying but not typically critical. They'd happened on this aircraft many times before. But on the 4th recurrence, the first officer decided to try something different. Without explicit instruction from the captain, he pulled the circuit breakers for the Flight Augmentation Computers, or FACs, numbers 1 and 2. The FAC is crucial. It helps the plane fly smoothly, controls the rudder, and provides flight envelope protection that prevents the aircraft from flying too fast, too slow, or at too steep an angle. Pulling both FAC circuit breakers simultaneously wasn't the right procedure for this alarm, and the consequences were immediate and severe. The moment those two FAC breakers were pulled, the autopilot disengaged. The auto-thrust system, which manages engine power, also disengaged. The aircraft pitched up. The captain, now flying manually, pushed forward on his side stick to lower the nose. But the first officer was pulling back on his own side stick. When both pilots make opposite inputs on an Airbus A320, the inputs are added together algebraically. The first officer's backward pull overrode much of the captain's push, and the nose kept rising. People initially assumed the thunderstorms had torn the plane apart or caused engine failure. The investigation, though, revealed something far more complex. It wasn't the weather directly, and it wasn't a sudden mechanical failure. The investigation uncovered a recurring fault with a solder joint on the flight warning computer, the same system that had triggered the initial alarm. This electrical fault had been logged 23 times in the 12 months before the crash. 23 times. Maintenance had addressed it repeatedly, usually with the same circuit breaker reset. This unresolved maintenance issue created pressure on the crew to make a critical, non-standard intervention under stress, which directly led to the loss of control. With the flight augmentation computers disabled and opposite control inputs being given, the nose pitched up dramatically, past 20 degrees. The speed bled away, the wings couldn't generate enough lift. The Airbus A320 entered an aerodynamic stall. The cockpit filled with a piercing, "Stall! Stall!" alarm, joined by other warnings. The aircraft was falling, sinking rapidly, nose high, through the sky. The captain shouted for the first officer to release his controls, to push forward. But the first officer kept pulling back on his side stick, making the stall worse. The aircraft became trapped by its own design. Its protections were gone. Its crew was fighting against conflicting inputs. It dropped. The rate of descent reached 20,000 feet per minute. Inside the cabin, panic erupted. Passengers strapped into their seats were subjected to terrifying G-forces as the plane tumbled. The wind screamed past the fuselage. The violent jolts continued. Alarms blared in the cockpit. They were falling. Fast. The Airbus plunged through the turbulent clouds. Inside the cabin, violent changes in pitch and altitude threw passengers against their seatbelts. Loose items flew, becoming deadly. There was a deep roar from outside, the sound of air tearing past the disintegrating airframe. In the cockpit, the stall alarm screamed continuously. The captain shouted instructions, his voice strained, desperate. The first officer was silent, eyes wide, staring at meaningless instruments. The ground proximity warning system blared its final warning. "Too low terrain! Too low terrain!" The dark water of the Karimata Strait rushed up with impossible speed. A final, desperate, futile attempt to push the nose down. Then impact. Silence. The impact wasn't a single, clean strike. The Airbus, still nose-high, slammed into the Karimata Strait in a violent, tearing force that ripped through metal and flesh. A colossal spray erupted, a wall of white water reaching hundreds of feet high. The fuselage crumpled instantaneously, tearing open along its length. Twisted metal, shattered windows, the entire structure folding in on itself. Water rushed in everywhere, cold, black, overwhelming. It tore through the cabin with unbelievable speed, consuming every space, every person. Passengers still strapped in were subjected to unimaginable G-forces. Bodies were thrown. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer were slammed forward, their bodies absorbing the final, brutal energy. The controls were useless. The alarm stopped abruptly, silenced by the sheer destruction. There was no time for a final thought, no last breath. The pressure was immense, instantaneous, inescapable. The aircraft disintegrated into unrecognizable fragments beneath the surface. The water swallowed everything. Darkness. There was no recovery. The speed at which Flight 8501 fell, combined with its nose-up attitude, meant that by the time the crew fully understood what was happening, they were already beyond saving. The aircraft was stalled, falling, and the water was rushing toward them at an incredible rate. Even the most skilled pilots in the world couldn't have saved it. The forces involved were simply too great. The time was too short. In the moments after impact, the Karimata Strait returned to an eerie calm, broken only by the natural sounds of the sea. Nothing floated on the surface to indicate what had happened, just the vast, open ocean. Back at Surabaya Juanda Airport, families waiting for Flight 8501 to arrive in Singapore got the first terrifying news. The flight had disappeared. No contact, no explanation. For those families, that initial uncertainty was torture. Within hours, search and rescue operations began. Indonesian authorities, with help from neighboring countries, launched a massive effort, deploying ships and aircraft to the last known position. The NTSC, Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, was notified and began preparing its team. The world watched, hoping for survivors, but as hours turned into days, the grim reality set in. The wreckage, scattered across the seafloor, and the bodies of all 162 people on board would eventually be found. Let me break down what actually happened. First, there was the recurring technical problem. The flight warning computer had a faulty solder joint. Maintenance logs showed this exact fault had come up 23 times in the year before the crash. 23 times it was addressed, often by resetting the system, but it was never truly fixed at its root. This created a situation where the crew on Flight 8501, facing this familiar yet annoying warning, felt compelled to take action. It wasn't an immediate catastrophic failure. It was a nagging, unresolved issue that wore down confidence in the system over time. When a problem keeps coming back, even if it's minor, it shifts how flight crews perceive and respond to it. It encourages deviation from strict protocols in pursuit of a quicker solution. This persistent fault, though not directly causing the crash, ignited the entire chain of events. It shows how a small, recurring technical glitch can set the stage for far graver outcomes if not definitively resolved. Second, the first officer's critical intervention played a pivotal role. When the alarm sounded for the fourth time, the first officer, without explicit instruction from the captain, pulled the circuit breakers for both flight augmentation computers. This was a significant departure from the standard procedure. The FACs are deeply integrated into the flight control system, managing rudder movement and providing vital flight envelope protection. Essentially, electronic guardrails that prevent the aircraft from entering dangerous attitudes like stalls or overspeeds. By pulling both FAC breakers, the first officer disconnected the autopilot, disengaged the autothrust, and removed the safeguards that would have prevented a dangerous attitude. This wasn't a malicious act. It was likely an attempt to solve a frustrating, recurring problem, but it stripped the aircraft of its automated defenses at a critical moment. It speaks to a gap in understanding the full implications of such an action, or a breakdown in adhering to approved troubleshooting steps when stressed by a repeating cockpit alert. Third, and most tragically, was the crew's uncoordinated response once automation disengaged. The moment the FACs were pulled, the aircraft pitched up sharply. The captain, correctly assessing the situation, immediately pushed forward on his side stick to lower the nose. But simultaneously, the first officer, likely disoriented by the sudden chaos and perhaps still trying to climb above the weather, was pulling back on his own side stick. On an Airbus, these control inputs are algebraically summed. If one pilot pushes and the other pulls, the aircraft receives a blended command. In this case, the first officer's persistent nose-up input nullified or even overrode the captain's corrective actions. This conflicting input made the pitch-up worse, rapidly bleeding away airspeed and driving the aircraft into a stall. The stall alarm was screaming. The captain was shouting instructions, yet the first officer continued to pull back, maintaining a nose-high attitude despite the urgent warnings. This complete breakdown in crew coordination, in a moment of extreme urgency, sealed the fate of everyone on board. Even highly experienced pilots, under immense stress, can struggle with fundamental control inputs and effective crew resource management when faced with a sudden, unexpected loss of automation and the chaos of blaring alarms. The NTSC's final report, KNKT.14.12.29.04, meticulously detailed the sequence of events. It confirmed that the recurring technical fault with the flight warning computer, while seemingly minor, created the conditions for a non-standard crew intervention. This action, pulling the flight augmentation computer circuit breakers, disarmed critical flight protections and automation. The subsequent, uncoordinated control inputs from the flight deck directly led the Airbus A320 into an unrecoverable stall. The investigation made clear that the focus needed to shift not just to preventing component failures, but critically, to how flight crews respond when automation unexpectedly disengages under stress, and how maintenance addresses persistent, nagging issues that might otherwise be overlooked. Because of the insights gained from this tragedy and other similar events, the aviation industry significantly enhanced upset prevention and recovery training, or UPRT standards. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, or EASA, issued Regulation 2015/640 in April 2015, mandating advanced UPRT for all airline pilots. This regulation ensures pilots receive hands-on training to recognize and recover from unusual attitudes in stalls, even at high altitudes, directly addressing the gaps in the crew's response. The worldwide implementation of such rigorous training, spurred by accidents like Flight 8501, has undoubtedly prevented countless potential losses and possibly saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in the years since. The 162 people on board Flight 8501 remain a stark reminder that aviation safety is a constant, evolving commitment. I've laid out the facts of Flight 8501. Given the first officer's non-standard action of pulling the FAC circuit breakers and the captain's subsequent struggle to regain control due to conflicting inputs, what do you think is the single most important change that needed to happen in pilot training or airline procedures after this accident? If you found this analysis useful, please hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds and really helps this channel reach more people who can learn from these stories. If you're interested in more deep dives into aviation history and safety, consider subscribing. My goal is to share these lessons, and your support helps keep this work going. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights add so much to our understanding.